I thought my husband wanted an open marriage because he was bored. What I didn't expect was that he had been quietly testing me for months. And when I finally learned the truth, our entire marriage collapsed in a single night. My name is Claire, I'm 32 years old, and this story started in Columbus, Ohio. From the outside, my life looked perfect. I lived in a modern house just outside the city. The kind of house with huge glass windows and a perfectly trimmed lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. There were 2 cars in the driveway, expensive vacations every year, designer clothes hanging in my closet, and a husband who everyone called the perfect man. His name was Daniel. Daniel was 35, calm, intelligent, and incredibly disciplined. He owned a tech consulting company that had exploded in growth over the past few years. Money was never a problem in our life. But the truth is, our relationship didn't start that way. Daniel and I met 8 years ago when my life looked completely different. Back then I was working as a bartender at a small lounge near Ohio State University. It wasn't a glamorous job. Dim lights, loud music, cheap cocktails, mostly college students trying to forget about exams. One Friday night Daniel walked in with 2 coworkers. I noticed him immediately because he looked completely out of place. While everyone else wore hoodies and sneakers, Daniel walked in wearing a navy blazer and a clean white shirt. He sat down at the bar and ordered a whiskey. Not the cheap kind, the good kind. While I was making the drink, we started talking. At first it was just normal small talk. But Daniel was different from most guys who came into that bar. Most of them tried to flirt or make dumb jokes. Daniel asked questions, real questions. He asked what I wanted to do with my life, why I was working there, what my goals were. No one had ever asked me those kinds of questions before. By the end of the night he left a $100 tip. But more importantly, he left his phone number. We went on our first date 2 days later. It was a small Italian restaurant in the short North District of Columbus. Nothing extremely fancy, just warm lights, quiet music, and good food. Daniel told me he worked in software consulting. At that time he was still trying to grow his business. He wasn't rich yet, but he had something that immediately caught my attention. Ambition. A lot of ambition. I remember him saying something during that first date that stayed in my mind. He said he didn't want a normal life. He wanted freedom. Freedom to work for himself. Freedom to travel whenever he wanted. Freedom to never worry about money. Back then I thought it sounded exciting. We started dating seriously within 3 months. And honestly, the first few years were amazing. Daniel worked hard, but he always made time for us. Weekend road trips across Ohio. Late night drives with music blasting through the speakers. Small surprises like flowers or random gifts. 2 years into our relationship, everything changed. Daniel's company landed a huge contract with a healthcare company. That single deal changed our entire life. Within a year Daniel went from struggling entrepreneur to extremely successful business owner. We moved out of our tiny apartment and into a beautiful house outside Columbus. New cars, better restaurants, luxury vacations, everything upgraded almost overnight. Friends started saying the same thing every time they visited our house. They would look around and say, "Wow, you're so lucky." And maybe I was. But as Daniel's success grew, something else slowly started changing too. The more successful Daniel became, the more he worked. 14-hour days became normal. Sometimes he worked entire weekends. At first I supported it. I told myself he was building something important. But after a while, I started feeling invisible. I would eat dinner alone, watch TV alone, go to bed alone. Meanwhile our social media looked perfect. Photos from luxury restaurants, pictures from vacations in Mexico and Europe, smiling selfies that made our life look like a dream. But behind those photos, we were barely talking anymore. Some days the only words we exchanged were good morning and good night. Still, I stayed. Part of me believed things would eventually go back to normal. Part of me loved the comfort of our lifestyle. And part of me still loved Daniel. But one night, everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening. Daniel came home earlier than usual. He poured himself a drink and sat down across from me at the kitchen island. He looked serious, not angry, not upset, just serious. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He asked me if I had ever thought about an open relationship. At first I laughed because I thought he was joking. But Daniel didn't laugh. He just looked at me and waited for my reaction. I asked him why he would even bring something like that up. His answer shocked me. He said he thought we both deserved to be happy. My heart started racing. Was he cheating? Was he asking permission to cheat? My mind was spinning with questions. But Daniel continued speaking calmly. Almost too calmly. He said we had started to feel more like roommates than a married couple. He said I deserved passion. And maybe he deserved passion too. Hearing that felt like someone punched me in the chest. I asked him the most important question I could think of. I asked if he was already seeing someone else. He immediately shook his head and said no. Then he said something strange. He said he just wanted honesty between us. That conversation lasted almost 2 hours. And during that entire conversation something about Daniel felt different. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't angry. He wasn't begging to fix the marriage. He sounded analytical, like he had been thinking about this for a long time, like he had already studied every possible outcome. Finally, I asked him something that I was afraid to hear the answer to. I asked if he still loved me. Daniel paused for a moment. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. He said he cared about me deeply. He didn't say love, he said care, and suddenly a thought entered my mind that had never been there before. Maybe Daniel didn't actually want this marriage anymore. Maybe he had already checked out emotionally. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation over and over again in my head. You deserve passion. Maybe I deserve passion too. At first I thought he must just be bored. But the more I thought about it, the more something didn't feel right. Daniel had always been loyal, disciplined, focused, so why would he suddenly want an open marriage? Unless he already believed our relationship wasn't real anymore. The next morning I woke up before Daniel. He had already left for work. His laptop was still sitting on the dining table. I wasn't planning to snoop. But when the screen lit up, I saw something that made my heart stop. A document, with my name on it. And when I opened it, I realized Daniel had been watching my behavior for months. Taking notes, tracking conversations, even writing down my reactions during certain arguments. It wasn't just a document. It was a detailed record, almost like a psychological study. And at the very top of the page, there was one sentence that completely shattered me. Testing whether Claire still loves me, or just the life I provide. At that moment I realized something terrifying. Daniel didn't ask for an open relationship because he wanted freedom. He asked, because he was trying to prove something. And I had no idea what conclusion he had already reached. I didn't know how long I sat there staring at Daniel's laptop. It felt like time had completely stopped. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the document again. Line after line, dates, observations, conversations we had months ago, arguments I barely even remembered. Daniel had written everything down like he was studying a case file. One entry from 3 months earlier said, Claire seemed more excited about the vacation announcement than about spending time together. Another one said, mentioned cutting back on spending. Claire immediately became defensive. My chest tightened as I read. It felt like I was reading a stranger's analysis of my life. Or worse, my husband's quiet judgment of me. Then I reached the most recent entry. It was from the night before. Proposed open relationship idea tonight. Claire looked shocked but not angry. Reaction unclear. Continue observing. Continue observing. The words made my stomach turn. I closed the laptop slowly. For the first time in years, I felt like I didn't understand the man I had married. Daniel had always been calm and logical, but this felt different. This felt calculated. That entire day I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying the conversation from the night before. Had he already decided our marriage was fake? Was the open relationship just a way to prove it? Or maybe, it was a test. When Daniel came home that evening, everything felt tense. He walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened. Like the conversation from the night before had been completely normal. He poured himself a drink again and leaned against the counter. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he asked casually if I had thought more about what he said. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. I tried to keep my voice calm. I asked him if he was serious about the open relationship. Daniel nodded slowly. He said he thought it might actually help us. Help us. The words sounded strange, like he was talking about a business strategy instead of our marriage. I asked him how exactly it would help. Daniel shrugged slightly. He said maybe experiencing other people would remind us why we chose each other in the first place. Or maybe it would help us understand what we were missing. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt hurt. Another part of me felt confused. And a small part of me felt curious. Daniel noticed my hesitation. Then he said something that surprised me. He said there would only be one rule. Absolute honesty. No secrets. If either of us met someone else, we would tell each other. No lying. No hiding. Just transparency. I stared at him for a long moment. The strange thing was, he didn't seem jealous. He didn't seem worried. He looked almost confident. That confidence made me uneasy. I finally asked him if he had someone in mind already. He shook his head. He said he hadn't even tried looking. He wanted to see what happened naturally. The conversation ended shortly after that. Neither of us officially agreed to anything. But the idea had been planted. And over the next few weeks, something strange started happening. Daniel became different, not distant, not angry, just observant. He watched me more carefully. Not in a creepy way, but in a quiet, thoughtful way. Like he was waiting for something. And then one night, we were invited to a party. One of Daniel's business partners was hosting a networking event downtown. Normally I hated those events. They were full of investors and entrepreneurs talking about deals and numbers. But that night I decided to go. Maybe I needed a distraction. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that our marriage wasn't already falling apart. The party was held in a luxury rooftop bar overlooking the Columbus skyline. Soft music played in the background, People laughed and talked while waiters walked around with trays of champagne. Daniel quickly got pulled into a conversation with some investors. I wandered toward the bar. That's when someone sat down next to me. He looked about my age. Tall, confident, friendly smile. He introduced himself as Marcus. We started talking casually. At first it was just small talk about the party. But the conversation flowed easily. Marcus was funny, relaxed, and he actually seemed interested in what I was saying. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. At some point he asked if I was here with someone. I told him I came with my husband. Marcus nodded respectfully, but the conversation kept going. And the strange part was, I noticed Daniel watching us from across the room. He didn't look angry. He didn't look jealous. He just observed quietly, almost like he expected this. That look made me feel uncomfortable. Later that night, on the drive home, Daniel asked me how the party was. His tone was casual, but there was something beneath it. I told him it was fine. Then he asked about Marcus. My hands tightened on my seatbelt. I asked how he knew Marcus's name. Daniel smiled slightly. He said he introduced himself earlier while I was in the restroom. My stomach dropped. Then Daniel said something that made the entire situation feel surreal. He asked if I was attracted to him. Just like that. Direct. No hesitation. I didn't know what to say. But Daniel reminded me of the rule. Honesty. So I admitted that Marcus seemed nice. Interesting. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he said something that completely stunned me. He said if I wanted to see Marcus again, I could. He said it calmly, like he was giving me permission to borrow the car. The drive home after that was silent. But my mind was racing. Because suddenly I realized something terrifying. Daniel wasn't just suggesting an open relationship. He was encouraging it, and I still didn't understand why. 3 days later I received a message on Instagram. It was Marcus. He said he enjoyed meeting me at the party. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. My finger hovered over the screen for a long time. Part of me knew I should ignore it. But another part of me kept thinking about Daniel's words. If you want to see him again, you can. Finally I replied, just coffee, nothing more. At least that's what I told myself. But when I met Marcus again that weekend, I had a strange feeling that I had just stepped into something much bigger than I understood. And somewhere deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel already knew exactly how this would end. I kept telling myself it was just coffee. Nothing more. That's what I repeated in my head the entire drive to the cafe. It was a small place in downtown Columbus, quiet and modern, the kind of spot people use to work remotely or have casual meetings. Marcus was already there when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me walk in and smiled like we were old friends. That simple gesture felt strangely refreshing. Daniel used to do things like that when we first started dating. Marcus ordered 2 coffees and we sat near the window. At first the conversation was harmless. Work, travel, random stories about growing up. Marcus worked in marketing for a sports company. He traveled a lot for work and had that easygoing personality that made conversations flow without effort. I noticed something else too. He actually listened. When I spoke, he didn't check his phone. He didn't interrupt. He asked follow-up questions. After an hour passed, Marcus asked something that caught me off guard. He asked if my husband knew I was there. For a moment I hesitated. But then I remembered Daniel's rule. Honesty. So I told him the truth. I told him Daniel actually encouraged me to meet him. Marcus looked surprised. Then he laughed a little. He said that sounded like the most confident husband in the world. I forced a small smile, but inside I felt uneasy. Because even I didn't fully understand why Daniel was so calm about it. The coffee turned into a walk through downtown. The walk turned into dinner. And by the end of the night Marcus asked if he could see me again. That moment felt heavier than it should have. Because saying yes suddenly meant something bigger. But I still heard Daniel's voice in my head. If you want to see him again, you can. So I said yes. When I got home that night, Daniel was sitting on the couch watching something on his laptop. He looked up when I walked in. Then he asked a single question. How was the coffee? Just like that. No anger, no jealousy, just curiosity. I told him it was good. Marcus was interesting. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he asked if I planned on seeing him again. The strange thing was, he didn't sound nervous. He sounded like someone waiting for test results. I told him Marcus asked me out again. Daniel took a sip of his drink and said something that made my stomach tighten. He said I should go. He said experiences like that were exactly why he suggested the open relationship. He said maybe we both needed to explore what we were missing. That night I barely slept again. Something about the situation felt strange. It wasn't normal for a husband to act like this. There was no jealousy, no tension, just quiet observation. Over the next few weeks Marcus and I started seeing each other more often. Dinner dates, walks around the city, drinks at rooftop bars. It felt exciting, new, simple. Marcus didn't know every detail of my life like Daniel did. He only saw the version of me I showed him. The relaxed version, the fun version, and I have to admit, I enjoyed it. But every time I came home, Daniel would ask the same calm questions. Did you have a good time? Do you like him? Do you feel excited when you see him? At first I thought he was just trying to understand the situation. But after a while it started feeling like an interview. Like he was gathering information. One night Marcus asked something that made me pause. He asked if my husband was seeing someone too. I realized I had no idea. Daniel never mentioned another woman. He never stayed out late. He never acted suspicious. He just worked, watched me, and asked questions. The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Marcus eventually asked me something else. He asked if I had ever considered leaving my husband. The question hit me like a cold splash of water. I told him it wasn't that simple. Daniel and I had a life together. A house, friends, memories. Marcus nodded but said something that stuck with me. He said people only stay in unhappy marriages when something is keeping them there. The words echoed in my mind long after that conversation ended. Because deep down, I knew exactly what he meant. The house, the lifestyle, the comfort, things Daniel had worked incredibly hard to build. Things I had become used to. That night when I came home, Daniel was sitting in the living room again. He looked up from his laptop. Then he asked something new. He asked if Marcus had mentioned the idea of me leaving my husband yet. My heart stopped. I stared at him in shock. I asked how he could possibly know that. Daniel didn't look surprised. He just leaned back in his chair and said something quietly. He said most affairs follow predictable patterns. First excitement, then emotional connection, then the question of leaving the spouse. He said it like someone explaining a business model. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked him why he seemed so certain about everything. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he closed his laptop slowly. He looked directly at me and said something that made my stomach twist. He said this entire situation was revealing exactly what he needed to know. I asked him what that meant. But Daniel just shook his head slightly. He said it wasn't time yet. Then he stood up and walked toward the bedroom like the conversation was over. I stayed there on the couch, staring at the dark screen of his laptop. Because at that moment I realized something terrifying. Daniel wasn't just observing anymore. He was waiting for something specific to happen. And I had the horrible feeling that I was walking directly into a trap I still couldn't see. The feeling that something wasn't right kept growing in the back of my mind. Every time I left the house to meet Marcus, I felt like Daniel was watching me in a way that was too calm, too controlled. Most husbands would argue. They would question everything. They would get jealous. Daniel did none of those things. Instead, he simply observed. A few weeks passed, and my routine slowly changed. Marcus and I started seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week. Dinner dates turned into longer nights. Longer nights turned into staying out late. And every time I came home, Daniel asked his usual questions. Did you enjoy yourself? Do you feel closer to him? Do you feel excited when he messages you? At first I answered honestly because that had been the rule. Honesty. But after a while it started feeling uncomfortable. Like I was reporting back to him. One night Marcus and I were sitting in his apartment downtown. The windows overlooked the city lights and soft music played in the background. Marcus looked relaxed, leaning back on the couch. Then he asked something that made the entire room feel quiet. He asked if I was happy in my marriage. The question felt heavier than it should have. I thought about Daniel, about the house, about the life we had built. But when I opened my mouth to answer, I hesitated. Marcus noticed immediately. He gave a small smile and said hesitation usually means no. I tried to explain that things were complicated. That Daniel and I had been together for years. That we had built a life together. Marcus listened carefully, then said something that stuck in my mind. He said people rarely stay in relationships because of love alone. Sometimes they stay because leaving would cost too much. Too much money, too much comfort, too much stability. His words made me uncomfortable. Because deep down, I knew he wasn't completely wrong. When I got home that night, Daniel was sitting in the living room again. Laptop open, glass of whiskey on the table beside him. He looked up calmly when I walked through the door. Then he asked the same question he always asked. Did you have a good time? I nodded. Then Daniel asked something slightly different. He asked if Marcus had started talking about the future yet. My stomach tightened. I asked him what he meant. Daniel leaned back slightly and spoke in that same analytical tone. He said relationships outside of marriage usually progress in stages. First attraction, then emotional bonding, then curiosity about whether the relationship could become permanent. He said eventually Marcus would ask if I had ever considered leaving my husband. I stared at him, because that exact conversation had happened only a few hours earlier. I asked him how he could possibly know that. Daniel gave a small shrug. He said people were predictable, especially when emotions were involved. Then he closed his laptop. But before he stood up, he said something that sent a chill through my body. He said we were getting close to the point where things would become clear. I asked him what exactly was supposed to become clear. But Daniel didn't answer. He simply walked toward the bedroom. The next few days I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. What was Daniel trying to prove? Why was he acting like this entire situation had a specific outcome? The more I thought about it, the more I started noticing something strange. Daniel's lifestyle hadn't changed at all. He still worked long hours, still woke up early, still went to meetings, but something about his schedule felt slightly different. He was home more often when I returned, almost like he knew exactly when I would walk through the door. One afternoon I decided to do something I had never done before. I went to Daniel's office. His company's headquarters was in a modern building downtown. I had visited a few times in the past, but not recently. When I walked in, the receptionist greeted me politely. She seemed a little surprised to see me. I asked if Daniel was in his office. She hesitated for a moment. Then she said he wasn't there. I asked when he would be back. She checked her screen and said he had taken the entire day off. The entire day? That didn't make sense. Daniel almost never took days off. I thanked her and walked back outside. Something about the situation felt wrong. So I drove home. When I opened the front door, the house was quiet. But Daniel's car was parked in the driveway. My heart started beating faster as I stepped inside. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Then I heard something from Daniel's office. The door was slightly open. I walked closer and pushed it open slowly. Daniel was sitting at his desk. Two large computer screens were glowing in front of him. For a second he didn't notice me. He was completely focused on the screens. And what I saw made my stomach drop. One of the screens showed a timeline. Dates, notes, photos, even screenshots of messages. It looked exactly like the document I had seen on his laptop weeks earlier. But now it was bigger. Much more detailed. The second screen had something else. A financial chart, graphs, numbers, bank accounts, and my name was written across several of the documents. Daniel suddenly noticed me standing there. He looked surprised for a moment. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair. The room went silent. I asked him what I was looking at. Daniel studied my face carefully before answering. Then he said something quietly. He said it was the final phase of the experiment. Experiment. The word echoed in my head. I asked him what experiment he was talking about. Daniel folded his hands together and looked directly at me. Then he said something that made my chest feel tight. He said he had spent the last 6 months trying to answer one question. One simple question. I asked him what it was. Daniel held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, he wanted to know if I loved him, or if I only loved the life he provided. And the moment he said that, I realized this entire open relationship had never been about freedom. It had been a test. And somehow, I had the horrible feeling that Daniel already believed he knew the answer. For a moment I just stood there in the doorway of Daniel's office, staring at the screens. The word experiment kept echoing in my head. Experiment, like our entire marriage had been turned into some kind of research project. I stepped further into the room. My eyes moved across the screens again. Dates, notes, screenshots, financial records. It felt invasive, cold, calculated. I asked Daniel how long he had been doing this. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed one of the windows on his screen and slowly turned his chair toward me. Then he said something that made my stomach sink. He said it started about 6 months ago. 6 months. That meant everything that had happened recently, the open relationship conversation, Marcus, all of it, had been planned during that time. I asked him why. Why would he do something like this instead of just talking to me? Daniel sighed quietly. For the first time since this whole thing began, he looked a little tired. He said he had tried talking before, but every time he brought up problems in the marriage, the conversations never really went anywhere. We would argue for a little while. Then things would go back to normal. The same routine, the same distance. He said eventually he started wondering something that scared him. He wondered if the only thing keeping our marriage together was the life he had built. The house, the comfort, the financial security. He said he needed to know the truth. Not just hear words. He wanted to see actions. I felt anger rising in my chest. I told him he had no right to manipulate me like this. To secretly watch my behavior like I was part of some study. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. Then he said something that made the anger in my chest turn into something else. Something closer to guilt. He said the moment he suggested the open relationship, he believed the answer would appear very quickly. But instead, he wanted to observe carefully. So he created boundaries, honesty, transparency, and then he waited. I asked him what he thought he had learned so far. Daniel glanced briefly at the screens before looking back at me. Then he said something that felt like a punch to the stomach. He said I hadn't once asked if he was seeing someone else. Not even once. I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued. He said most people who truly feared losing their partner would immediately worry about competition, jealousy, protectiveness, but I never showed that. Instead, I focused entirely on my own new relationship. I felt defensive. I told him that was because he acted so calm about everything. But Daniel shook his head slowly. He said calmness doesn't erase love. It doesn't erase fear. He said something else too. Something that made my chest tighten. He said I seemed happier over the past few weeks than I had been in years. And none of that happiness involved him. I didn't know how to respond to that, because part of me knew it was true. Then Daniel stood up from his chair. He walked past me and into the living room. I followed him. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument. Daniel picked up his glass of water from the kitchen counter. Then he looked at me again. His voice was still calm, but there was something more serious underneath it now. He said the experiment was almost over. I asked what that meant. Daniel explained that every test needs a final variable. One final moment that reveals the truth. I asked him what that moment was supposed to be. Daniel hesitated for a second. Then he said Marcus was going to ask me something soon. Something important. My heart started beating faster. I asked him what Marcus was supposed to ask. Daniel held my gaze. Then he said Marcus would eventually ask if I was ready to leave my husband. The room felt suddenly very quiet. I asked Daniel how he could be so sure. Daniel walked over to the window and looked outside. Then he said something that made my stomach twist again. He said Marcus had already asked him for advice. My mind went blank for a moment. I asked him what he meant. Daniel turned back toward me. Then he calmly explained something that made the entire situation feel surreal. Marcus worked with one of Daniel's marketing partners. They had met months earlier during a business event. When Marcus started getting serious about me, he had asked Daniel privately if the open relationship situation was real. Daniel told him it was. Marcus had no idea that the man he was asking about was the husband he was competing with. The realization hit me like a wave. This entire situation had layers I never even saw. Daniel had been watching everything from the beginning. Every message, every date, every conversation. He wasn't just observing me. He was observing Marcus too. I felt my chest tighten with frustration. I asked Daniel why he didn't just stop everything if he already knew where it was going. Daniel's answer was quiet but firm. He said because he needed the truth. Not assumptions, not promises, the truth. Then he said something that made the air in the room feel heavy. He said when Marcus asks the question, the experiment will finally end. And whatever decision I make in that moment will determine whether our marriage survives or ends forever. I stood there silently, trying to process everything. Because suddenly the situation felt completely different. This wasn't just an open relationship anymore. It was a final decision. A choice between two completely different lives. And Daniel had already made it clear. He was ready to accept whatever answer I gave. But deep down, I had the terrifying feeling that Daniel had already prepared for the worst possible outcome. For the next few days, the house felt completely different. Daniel and I still spoke. We still ate dinner in the same kitchen. We still slept in the same bed. But everything felt distant. Like two strangers quietly waiting for something inevitable to happen. Neither of us mentioned the conversation in his office again. But I could feel it hanging in the air between us. The experiment, the final question, the decision that would determine the future of our marriage. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, my stomach tightened. Because now I understood something I hadn't realized before. Every step I took was being watched. Not secretly anymore, but knowingly. Daniel wasn't hiding it. He had made it clear. He was waiting. 2 days later Marcus asked if I wanted to have dinner at his apartment. His message was casual, but something about the timing made me uneasy. I remembered what Daniel had said. He's going to ask soon. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Finally I agreed. That evening I drove downtown again. Marcus lived in a modern apartment building with a view of the city skyline. When he opened the door, he greeted me with the same warm smile he always had. Inside, dinner was already prepared. Candles on the table, soft music playing. The entire setup looked like something carefully planned. My heart started beating faster because I suddenly knew this wasn't just another dinner. Marcus seemed slightly nervous. He poured wine for both of us and we sat down. At first we talked about normal things. Work, a movie we had both seen recently. But Marcus kept glancing at me in a way that felt different. Like he was preparing himself to say something important. Halfway through dinner he finally put his glass down. Then he looked at me seriously. He asked how things were going with Daniel. The question immediately made my chest tighten. I told him things were complicated. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he said something I had been expecting, but still wasn't ready to hear. He said he had started developing real feelings for me. Not just attraction, not just excitement, something deeper. I stayed quiet. Marcus continued. He said he knew the situation with my marriage was unusual, but he wanted to be honest about what he felt. He said he didn't want to keep seeing me if I was always going to belong to someone else. Then he asked the question. The exact question Daniel had predicted. He asked if I had ever seriously considered leaving my husband. The room felt completely silent. For a moment I couldn't even find the words to respond. Because suddenly Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. This is the final variable. Marcus leaned forward slightly. He told me he wasn't asking for an immediate decision, but he needed to know if there was a real future between us. He said he wouldn't pressure me, but he also didn't want to continue something that would never become real. My thoughts felt chaotic. On one side, there was Marcus. Exciting, new, simple. On the other side, there was Daniel. Years of history, a shared life. And now, This strange experiment that had revealed more about our relationship than I ever expected. Marcus waited patiently. He didn't rush me. He simply watched my face. And the longer I stayed silent, the more I realized something painful. I didn't actually know what my answer was. That realization scared me more than anything. Because if I truly loved Daniel the way a wife should, the answer should have been immediate. It should have been obvious. But instead, I hesitated. Marcus noticed. He leaned back slightly and sighed. Then he asked another question. One that cut even deeper. He asked if the only thing keeping me in my marriage was the life my husband had built. The house, the money, the comfort. Hearing someone say those things out loud made my chest tighten with guilt. Because I had asked myself that same question before. Marcus spoke gently. He said he didn't have Daniel's money or lifestyle. But he could offer something else. A real relationship. Something simple and honest. Then he said something that made the decision feel even heavier. He said if I chose him, we could start over somewhere new. No complications. No secrets. Just a fresh start. The words hung in the air between us. My heart was racing, because I knew exactly what this moment meant. This was the choice Daniel had been waiting for. The final moment of his experiment. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. His voice was quiet but serious. He asked me one last question. If I had to choose right now, who would I choose? My mind felt completely overwhelmed. Images flashed through my thoughts. The first night Daniel and I met at the bar. Our tiny apartment when we first started dating. The moment we bought our house. The years we spent building a life together. But then other images appeared too. All the nights I ate dinner alone. All the weekends Daniel spent working. All the times I felt invisible in my own marriage. Marcus was still holding my hand, waiting for my answer. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. No matter what I said next, my life was about to change forever. Because somewhere across the city, Daniel was probably sitting quietly in our house, waiting to hear the outcome of the final test. Marcus was still holding my hand across the table. His apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of music playing somewhere in the background. But inside my head, everything felt loud. My heart was racing. My thoughts were jumping from one memory to another. Marcus watched my face carefully, waiting for an answer. But the longer I stayed silent, the more pressure I felt building in the room. Finally he spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was a seriousness behind it. He said he wasn't trying to rush me, but he needed to know where he stood. He said he couldn't keep building feelings for someone who might never truly leave their marriage. Those words made my chest tighten. Because deep down, I knew he was right. This situation couldn't stay in the middle forever. Eventually there had to be a decision. I looked down at the table for a moment. Then I slowly pulled my hand back from his. Marcus noticed immediately. His expression changed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. I took a deep breath before speaking. I told him I cared about him. The time we had spent together had been exciting. Different. For the first time in a long time, I had felt seen. I had felt interesting again. Marcus listened quietly, but I continued speaking. I told him there was something he didn't fully understand about my life with Daniel. It wasn't just a marriage. It was years of shared history. Years of building something together. Marcus nodded slowly, but he asked the question again. If it came down to a choice, who would I choose? The room felt completely still. And in that moment I realized something important. Daniel's experiment had forced me to look at my life honestly for the first time in years. Not just the good parts. The uncomfortable parts too. Yes, I had enjoyed the lifestyle Daniel created. Yes, I had grown used to the comfort. But that wasn't the entire truth. There were also memories, moments, a life we had built long before money was ever involved. I looked back at Marcus. Then I gave him my answer. I told him I couldn't leave my husband. The words felt heavy, but they were clear. Marcus looked down for a moment. Then he slowly nodded. He didn't seem angry, just disappointed. He said he had suspected that might be the answer. But he had needed to hear it directly from me. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. Finally Marcus stood up and walked toward the window. He looked out at the city lights below. Then he said something quietly. He said he hoped Daniel understood how lucky he was. Because not every marriage survived situations like this. I didn't know how to respond. Eventually I stood up too. I thanked Marcus for being honest with me. For giving me clarity about my own feelings. He walked me to the door. Before I left, he said something else. He said sometimes people don't realize what they have until they're forced to imagine losing it. I nodded. Then I walked out into the hallway. The drive home felt longer than usual. My mind kept replaying the conversation over and over again. The decision, the relief, but also the anxiety, because I knew the moment I walked through the front door, Daniel would know the experiment was over. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house lights were still on. Daniel's car was parked in the same spot. I stepped inside slowly. The house was quiet, but I could see light coming from the living room. Daniel was sitting on the couch with his laptop again. He looked up the moment I walked in. His expression was calm, just like it had been throughout this entire situation. But there was something else in his eyes now. Anticipation. He closed the laptop slowly and set it on the table. Then he asked the question. The only question that mattered. Did Marcus ask you to leave your husband? My heart was beating hard as I nodded. Daniel watched my face carefully. Then he asked the second question. And what was your answer? For a moment the entire house felt silent. This was the moment his experiment had been building toward. I looked directly at him. Then I told him the truth. I told him I chose my husband. Daniel didn't react immediately. He just sat there quietly for a few seconds. Then he leaned back slightly and exhaled. It was the first time in months that I saw real emotion on his face. Relief. But it wasn't pure relief. There was something else mixed with it. Something heavier. Daniel finally spoke again. His voice was calm but serious. He said the experiment had given him the answer he needed. But it had also revealed something else. Something that couldn't be ignored anymore. My stomach tightened as I asked what he meant. Daniel looked at me carefully. Then he said something that made the entire situation shift again. He said the real question was no longer whether I loved him. The real question was whether the damage that led to this experiment could actually be repaired, because even though I had chosen him, the fact that I hesitated at all had already changed something between us forever. For a long moment after Daniel said that, neither of us spoke. The silence in the living room felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. I stood near the doorway, still holding my car keys, while Daniel sat on the couch staring at the dark screen of his laptop. The words he had just said kept repeating in my mind. Even though I had chosen him, something between us had changed. I slowly walked further into the room and sat down across from him. My heart was still racing from the entire night. I asked him what he meant by damage. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time since this entire situation began, he didn't look calm or analytical. He looked tired, emotionally tired. Finally he spoke. He said the experiment had answered the question he started with. He knew now that I wasn't ready to walk away from the marriage. But the process had also shown him something else. Something much harder to ignore. He said we had allowed our relationship to slowly fade long before Marcus ever entered the picture. The open relationship hadn't created the problem. It had only exposed it. Hearing that made my chest tighten. Because deep down I knew he was right. For years we had both been living separate lives in the same house. Daniel focused on work. I focused on enjoying the life his work provided. And somewhere along the way, the connection between us slowly disappeared. Daniel stood up and walked toward the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Then he looked at me again. He said something that surprised me. He said the experiment hadn't only been about me. It had been about him too. I asked him what he meant. Daniel explained that when he started building his company, he believed he was doing it for both of us. He wanted to create security, freedom, a future where we would never struggle financially. But somewhere along the way, work had become his entire identity. He stopped noticing how much distance was growing between us. By the time he finally realized it, he wasn't sure if the love was still real or just routine. That uncertainty was what pushed him to create the test. Hearing that softened some of the anger I had been carrying. Because for the first time I could see the fear behind his actions. Daniel wasn't trying to trap me. He had been terrified of living the rest of his life in a marriage that only existed because it was comfortable. He walked back into the living room and sat down again. Then he asked me something quietly. He asked if I had ever truly thought about leaving him. I hesitated for a second before answering honestly. I told him that during the past few weeks, the thought had crossed my mind. Not because I hated him, but because I had started wondering if we had already grown too far apart. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't seem surprised by that answer. Then he asked the final question. The one that felt even more important than the experiment itself. He asked if I still wanted this marriage. Not out of comfort, not out of habit, but because I actually wanted to rebuild it. The question hung in the air between us. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I thought about our relationship without hiding behind the comfortable parts. I thought about the nights we laughed together in our tiny apartment. The road trips we used to take before his company exploded. The way we used to talk for hours about our future. Those memories reminded me that our marriage hadn't always been distant. It had once been full of excitement and partnership. And that meant something important. If it had existed before, maybe it could exist again. I looked at Daniel and gave him an honest answer. I told him yes, but only if we were both willing to change things. Not just pretend everything was fine and fall back into the same routine. Daniel listened carefully. Then he asked what I thought needed to change. I told him the truth. The house, the cars, the vacations, none of those things mattered if we barely saw each other. I said I didn't need a perfect lifestyle. I needed a partner who was actually present in the relationship. Daniel stayed quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. He admitted that he had been using work as an escape. Building the company had become easier than dealing with the emotional distance in our marriage. But he said something else too. He said rebuilding trust would take time. The experiment had revealed uncomfortable truths for both of us. and those truths couldn't just disappear overnight. I agreed, but for the first time in a long while, the conversation didn't feel like two strangers talking. It felt like two people actually trying to understand each other again. Daniel closed his laptop and pushed it aside. Then he did something simple that we hadn't done in a long time. He sat down next to me on the couch. Not across the room, not at the other end of the table. Next to me. For a moment neither of us spoke. But the silence felt different now. Less heavy, more thoughtful. Finally Daniel said something quietly. He said the experiment was over. No more tests. No more observation. From now on, the only thing that mattered was whether we were both willing to rebuild what we had lost. I looked around the living room. The same house, the same furniture, the same life we had been living for years. But somehow everything felt slightly different now. Because for the first time in a long time, our future wasn't just about maintaining a comfortable routine. It was about deciding whether we were willing to fight for the relationship we once had. And that decision would shape everything that came next.